I've called this talk The End of the Affair, when intellectual and literary heroes disappoint. Some authors become our heroes. They inform, they illuminate, they guide us through the uncertainties of life. They've earned our gratitude. We read each new book avidly and we wait eagerly for the next. But what happens when an idol disappoints, either in his or her life or art? The issue of literary heroes is actually a really fraught one. If you believe in great works and you believe in great works that endure, then that is works that separate from their author. The author, as a hero, is difficult to defend, but certainly something happens from the reader's perspective. Some sort of connection happens with the author of a work, or with at least an imagined version of the author of the work. And I will talk more about that during this talk. But I will say that when I first considered this talk, I was talking to a very literary friend of mine, and he was absolutely horrified that I would be discussing this issue. Back in 2017, I read A Long Saturday, a slender book of conversations between the literary scholar and critic George Steiner and the French journalist Laura Adler. Conversations is the term used on the cover of the book, but more accurately, Adler interviews Steiner, and she does so with familiar ease and admirable perspicacity. George Steiner, who died early this year at the age of 90, has been a lifelong companion for me, an enduring love. From the time I first read his extraordinary collection of essays, Language and Silence, a very well-thumbed copy this one is, as a 20-year-old, through his many books, essays and interviews, this man has afforded me pleasure, stimulation, understandings, excitement, inspiration, questions. Steiner feeds and awakens my curiosity. No long-term partner could have been so consistently rewarding. I was happily immersed in this latest book, acknowledging familiar Steinerisms, delighting in new offerings, when I came to a section where in a single page, Steiner is rudely dismissive of Simone Weil, Hannah Arendt, and Simone de Beauvoir. Three women scholars discarded in a handful of lines. In recent years, Steiner has been far more mindful of women, acknowledging, among other things, their historical lack of opportunity in intellectual life. But no male writer mentioned in A Long Saturday warrants such curt dismissal as Steiner gives these three women. It would seem that Steiner, born in 1929, remains a man of his generation, whose own heroes are exclusively male. I find myself wondering if his recent inclusiveness of women is nothing more than lip service, something he knows he must be seen to be doing. So, for example, he's critical in A Long Saturday of the former Oxbridge tradition of seating men and women separately, but nonetheless he joined the practice uncritically for decades. He's a scholar who has argued persuasively, both in the present volume and elsewhere, about the importance of polyglottism, of reading, of knowing the greats in their original language. Yet this man, who confesses to being unable to read Russian, cites Akhmatova and Svetaeva as women to admire. These are the only women who receive his praise in this volume. But given he can't read them in the original Russian, it is questionable praise, even demeaning praise. He seems to suggest that their work doesn't warrant a reading in their original language. It leaches both the poet and the critic of dignity. And by the way, he never mentions Virginia Woolf. He dismisses Hannah Arendt as follows, quote, "I was unfortunate enough to meet Hannah Arendt. Very little of her work is first-rate, in my opinion. A woman who writes a huge volume on the origins of totalitarianism and doesn't say a word about Stalin because her husband was a true Stalinist communist? No, thank you. Hannah Arendt, like Steiner, is one of my intellectual heroes. But rather than leaping to her defense, I am wanting to silence Steiner, to stop her these appalling statements that condemn him far more than they do her. So he doesn't like Arendt as a person. But you don't have to like your literary heroes. Not that I'm suggesting Arendt could ever be one of Steiner's heroes. The fact is, you get the best of a writer in her or his works, those works over which they've pored and thought and considered and redrafted. Conversation, on the other hand, while drawing on years of scholarship, nonetheless is marked by spontaneity. There's no second or third or 10th draft to refine the argument and smooth the syntax. I've always been happy enough not to meet my heroes. So it's of no import that Steiner did not like Arendt. But as for his next complaint and the sole example he provides as to why he dismisses her work, this I don't understand. The third part of Arendt's work on totalitarianism, it's a whole book, is devoted to National Socialism under Hitler and Bolshevism under Stalin. Far from Arendt ignoring Stalin, Stalin, along with Hitler, is the major focus of this third book of her study, her husband notwithstanding. When Steiner turns his attention to Weil, again he begins with a personal aside. This is a quote. General de Gaulle said, "She's mad," which is an opinion difficult to refute. Like his throwaway comment about meeting Arendt, this quip does no one any favours. Steiner continues, Weil writes some very fine things, but very little. This comes across as insulting, underscored by his use of the term things to refer to her work. He continues, and I quote, allow me some blind prejudices. A woman who refuses to enter a Catholic church, saying she is too Jewish at the time of Auschwitz. No, thank you. It's inexcusable. If there is a last judgment, that woman is in a lot of trouble. Yes, I expect this is the voice of blind prejudice, a stance Steiner would be quick to criticise in others. But as well, it's a statement that lacks Steiner's usual clarity. Indeed, I remain unsure what he exactly means. All he deigns to say about Simone de Beauvoir is, she was a great woman. She was very lucky to live with Sartre. Very lucky. That was a truly intelligent choice. That is, her greatness lies in her choice of Sartre. This is so rude and sarcastic, so utterly contemptible, I read it 3 times to make sure I'd not misunderstood. Steiner's swipe at de Beauvoir suggests that Sartre is a writer he does admire, and this is in fact the case. Later in this slender book, Steiner criticises Sartre for his blind support of the Soviet regime, but unlike Arendt, de Beauvoir and Weil, Sartre's political allegiances, in this case communist, do not contaminate Steiner's appreciation of the work. Now, Sartre was a good philosopher, some might say even a great one, but as a novelist he was very ordinary. I read all his novels in my 20s, but they resist a second reading. The philosophy paralyzes the fiction, there are long static sections, the temperature and tone remain caught in an existential trough. This notwithstanding, while Steiner disposes of de Beauvoir, both person and work, in a flippant sentence, Sartre's work, it seems, is beyond reproach. There is, though, a crucial feature about heroes. They may let you down, they may betray your belief in them, yet nonetheless you keep them in your personal pantheon, as I have done with Steiner. I'm not tempted to throw him over, rather I wish he hadn't made his appalling comments. Of course, there are exceptions here with heroes. Early in his writings, Nietzsche heaped praise on Wagner. One of his last writings, it may even have been his last, was the case against Wagner, how the mighty have fallen. So heroes can be discarded, but often they're not. We pardon our heroes their failings because of what they have given us and continue to give us in some of their books. It's like the beloved partner who strays and then wants to return. You don't need to forgive her or him. All you need to do is work out whether your life is enriched by their presence, whether you are enriched by their presence. Their act was unforgivable, unpardonable, but in the end, you take them back. You want them like you want your intellectual heroes, right there in the centre of your life, because it enriches that life. One of my heroes, Steiner, has disappointed me, let me down, betrayed my faith in him. This intellectual lover has done me wrong. One feels it so personally. But I know I won't do to Steiner as he has done to Arendt, Weil, and de Beauvoir. I know that the occasional lapse, and yet yes, there have been a few over the years, is insufficient for me to end this affair. Steiner can be pompous. He can be unnecessarily obscure. His sentences can become clotted, and at times a myopic male perspective clouds both his view and his judgment. But my life is richer for George Steiner. He's earned his place in my pantheon. Yet, as I continued through that book of conversations and came across a few more personal comments I wish had been edited out, I found myself wondering about intellectual heroes. After all, it's the work that matters, so why have intellectual heroes at all? The answer lies, I believe, in the intimacy of reading, the unparalleled intimacy of reading, and how this connects with a fertile imagination. These heroes creep up on you. Hour after hour, there's just you and the work in a connection that proceeds at your pace, that draws on all that's in your mind, spurred on by all that is in the author's work and mingling with it. Over the course of my adult life, I have spent days and weeks at a time with George Steiner. This is more than a one-night stand. This is more than a long weekend. This is a full-blown affair. I have witnessed the reoccurrence of certain themes, certain books, certain authors, certain composers. I feel I know something of the man. I spend the time with Steiner, a day or week or month with him. Someone asks me what I've been doing and I reply, I've been reading George Steiner. I rarely say I've spent the time with, say, No Passion Spent or Real Presences, both of which are books of his. Some years ago, I attended a Steiner lecture. I've listened to recordings of him. I know his voice. Sometimes when reading a difficult passage in one of his books, I hear his voice in the process of my deciphering his meaning. People will say they are a devotee of Henry James or an ardent follower of Jane Austen or Virginia Woolf or Proust or indeed George Steiner. When it comes to literary and scholarly loves, when it comes to creative loves, whether writers, artists or composers, it's the person we tend to cite, not the work. It's the person we feel we have the bond with. But of course we don't bond with the author. We can't. We don't know them. We've never met them. But it doesn't feel like this. You've bedded down in the imagination with these authors and their work. It's hard to separate the two because the author whom you've not met and will never meet is the work as you understand it, the work that has captivated you for hour after unbroken hour. The work? The author? Who knows? But something has inspired in you thoughts and ideas that surprise and delight you. Sometimes it feels to me that I'm more connected with certain authors than with people in my everyday life, or rather an imagined version of certain authors. Pity help me if ever I were to meet them in real life. For this reader, through the intimacy of reading, the author and the work tend to fuse. So what happens with heroes with unforgivable values? Can they become heroes? What to do with the anti-Semitic Ezra Pound, the thoroughly unlikable and increasingly reactionary Evelyn Waugh, the often bullying and also very seductive Susan Sontag, as portrayed in Benjamin Moses' recent biography and other writings since her death. And you could also mention Robert Lowell, Doris Lessing, at least from the point of view of Jenny Diski, and many other writers who are known to have behaved very, very badly indeed. I've just said that when I read George Steiner, the man and the work are fused for me. This is not the case with Ezra Pound. I can admire his poetry, but I read him differently than I do Steiner. Pound was already tainted by his reputation when I first read him. I was predisposed against the man, and, I'm ashamed to say, this affected my appreciation of his work. Why ashamed? Why would I be sorry about this? It's this issue of literary heroes, how the work and the creator tend to become fused. You see, I do also believe that great works live on after an author has died. Great works have to exist separate from the authors and composers and painters that created them. And I do believe in greatness when it comes to works of art. I read Shakespeare. His work is compelling, is inspiring, profound, funny. I take his work into my life. Specific works, Lear, Titus Andronicus, and the history plays. I reread Shakespeare and Goethe, but I don't think of them as my literary heroes, and yet their works are found prominently in my literary pantheon. So I wonder what's going on here. Is this just an issue of the dominance of the present? The contemporary focus on experience, that the authors that are my heroes are the ones that I have actually grown up with? Have I become a terrible cliche? These are interesting points that I hope we'll consider in the discussion that we have. Nothing anyone will ever write about Susan Sontag will change my opinion of her. I have my own Susan Sontag, and she's inviolate. So she was a bully. She played terrible games with her female lovers, less so the male ones. She was in the closet, she who held truth to be such a high value. But like Steiner, she's a lifelong love. I knew her work before I knew any personal qualities about her. A dear friend of mine, reading the Moser biography for review, he was going to review it, commented to me that Sontag was an appalling woman. How much of her work have you read? I asked. Not much, he replied, and most particularly, she was not a formative influence on him as she was for me, as she was for so many people. The person and their work. Pound came to me already tainted. It shaped my reading. Sontag and Steiner came to me through their work, through the intimacy of reading over many, many years, untainted by anything about them personally. They gave me experience of a mind at work, my mind at work. I'm very grateful, and it makes a difference. So, are there heroes who stay and heroes who have failed you too often? Oh yes. Certain authors bowl you over at first contact and will, through successive books, stay with you for a lifetime. Others will disappoint you with successive books until you finally give them up. I can reread Virginia Woolf and Patrick White, and each rereading yields riches. I would like a copy of Mrs. Dalloway beside me on my deathbed. I would always read a new Julian Barnes for what he has given me in the past, even though I don't much care for all of his books, or some of his books I don't care for, most of them I do. The same could be said for Graham Swift. I'm teetering with Elizabeth Strout. I was bowled over by Abide With Me, a brilliant portrayal of grief, and I've read everything of hers since that first contact. The character of hers that has the least traction with me is Olive Kitteridge, and Strout will keep coming back to her. I've not read her latest, Olive, again, and I don't intend to. And then there's Anne Patchett. She's holding on with a thin thread. The fact is that Bel Canto, written 20 years ago now, is far and away her best, and none of the many books she's written since, all of which I've read, come close. There's a point when the start of the love, the trigger for the love, is too far distant, and it simply is not getting the nourishment it needs to continue on. So you give up. I will, by the way, never give up on Pat Barker or Colin McCann. The authors who remain through successive books tend to be those whose novels are shaped around fundamental human concerns and themes: love, hate, jealousy, revenge, conflict, grief, and so on. These are the same themes that were taken up in the work of the ancient Greek dramatists, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. The work endures because we humans fundamentally are as we've always been. When I look at the authors that I continue to read through successive books, they are concerned with fundamental human concerns, and while occasionally the fiction fails them and they write a dud, mostly they don't, and even when there are faults, their books still speak to me, and Graham Swift is a really good example here. Now, rereading past loves, past heroes, can be a risky business because there are people who fall out of favour, but for different reasons than, for example, Anne Patchett, who's hanging on by a thread. And I'm going to tell you the sorry tale of the Alexandrian Quartet by Lawrence Durrell. I remember it well, 1970, hours, days spent on the third floor of the Monash Library. A bunch of us sitting around talking, oh, so seriously. Indeed, if talk could change the world, and we thought it could, paradise would have been achieved around the time of graduation. There were days spent at the library and evenings at someone's place, sitting on sticky carpet or odorous couches, cask wine, coon cheese, not ideologically incorrect back then, water biscuits, chips, lots of chips, and more talk. And always the talk was peppered with references, great political and philosophical and sociological thinkers. And for some of it, I among them, there was the literature. The literature rarely was referenced in the conversation, but it infused those days and nights. At least it did for me. I thought I was living inside Lawrence Durrell's Alexandrian Quartet, or at least as close as I ever was going to get to Justine and Claire, Balthazar and Mount Olive. I cannot think of those days without the Justine and Claire volumes in particular coming to the fore. In one of my many house moves, I lost those precious volumes, but it was fine. I carried them in my head, or at least I thought I did, until a few years ago when I bought the 4 volumes second hand. They could have been mine, similar Faber editions to my originals, and they could have been mine. I was wanting to relive the excitement, the romance, the sex, the sparks and depths of those times, those books. Justine had been my favourite, so I started with that volume. I managed just 40 pages before I gave up, not in disgust, but with great sadness, a sense of loss and bemusement too. How foreign and gullible are our younger selves. Ignorance does not know itself, and youth seems so wise to the young. Oh, I'm sounding so old. I wish I'd not returned to the Alexandrian Quartet, that I'd left the illusions of youth intact and Durrell one of my heroes. I don't dare to revisit Lawrence and Huxley and Fitzgerald, who also garnished those old days. But so did Woolf and James, Doris Lessing, Iris Murdoch, and a swag of feminist writers. Of those that have not lasted the distance, there are many of those feminist books that had me singing and marching through the streets. They served their purpose at the time. Beware, I say, of revisiting old loves. You find the right books at the right time. It just fell into my lap, you exclaim, but it didn't. Much led to this book at this time: memory, understanding, knowledge, need, fleeting conversation. But of those books you take with you, Woolf, White, Steiner, Iris Murdoch, they have accompanied you through the times, have lived those times with you and given them meaning. No danger in rereading them, and they are very close companions. Very occasionally, a baddie, someone that you didn't read, becomes a goodie. In my case, it wasn't Ezra Pound, but it was someone else. Sylvia Plath died on a freezing February night in 1963. She was separated from Ted Hughes at the time. She was living in a flat in Primrose Hill with her 2 young children. Her death, the brilliant poet, the woman scorned, was taken up by the early feminists, or the feminists of the 60s and 70s, most particularly by Robin Morgan, whose poem Monster was published in 1972, in which she accuses Al Alvarez and Ted Hughes for Plath's suicide. I was 22 when Morgan's work was published. I believe my copy, it was blue and cheaply made, was some underground version, actually, a sort of Western version of the Soviet samizdat form. I read Plath closely and regularly, Ariel in particular, and I hated Ted Hughes, although I confess I'd never read him. Hates are often unsubstantiated and often display appalling ignorance. Through the years, I came across the occasional Ted Hughes poem, but I was prejudiced against them even before I began to read, and any appreciation was extremely grudging. In 1998, Hughes's Birthday Letters was published, not long after he died. I'd grown up by this time and become suspicious of ideologies too. I read this collection in shock and wonder. I read through to the end and immediately returned to the beginning. These poems are truly great. Their power and concision, their emotional undercurrents, they affected me greatly. They still do. I was so wrong about Ted Hughes. I mindlessly followed an ideology, but we all did then, and it made me stupid. I judged where I had no right to judge. Youth can do that. Blind adherence to an ideology can do that. And I had missed out on some of the best poetry written in English during the last century. I've now read much, probably most, of Ted Hughes's work. It's been a real privilege, and I've read his wonderful letters. How could my younger self not at least surmise the pain of this man whose life was blighted with tragedy? If you live long enough, you can change. Heroes come and go, but the books will always be there. New books, old books, and the possibility always of enduring love.